This is John Drabinski, and you're listening to the Black Studies Podcast, a Mellon Grant-sponsored series of conversations examining the history of the field. Our conversations engage with a wide range of activists and scholars, senior figures in the field, late doctoral students, and everyone in between, culture workers, and political organizers, in order to explore the cultural and political meaning of Black studies as an area of inquiry and its critical methods. Today's conversation is with Shaida Akbarian, who teaches in the Department of Comparative Studies at Ohio State University, where she also earned her PhD in African American and African Studies. In this conversation, we discuss the complex meanings of Black studies as an intellectual tradition, a political disposition, and the various impasses and hesitations that lie at the heart of the relation between those two aspects of the field. Shaida, welcome to the Black Studies Podcast. How are you today?
I'm good. How are you, John?
I'm great. Really excited to have a chance to talk to you today on this podcast and all the questions around, the meaning of Black studies, its past, present, future, sort of how you think of yourself and your work and your thinking in relation to it. For a number of reasons, not the least of which is you graduated, I don't know when recent starts and stops, but recently in my mind anyway, from a Black Studies PhD program. And so for me, I think it's really important to talk and think about perspectives on the field from people who've graduated with degrees actually in the field. And I know you work in an ethnic studies department, so you've been able to continue a lot of this area studies work. So I really like your thinking, I like your work, and all of that combined. I'm just really excited to have a chance to talk today.
Thank you. Likewise. It's seriously an honor. I'm always looking forward to having conversation with you.
Well, as John Murillo pointed out or said at the end of podcast just recently, it is nice to sometimes just talk shop about what we do rather than pitch our books or pitch our candidacies. So really happy to have the chance to do that with somebody whose own doctoral training is invested in this field. But before we get into some of those questions about, what is Black studies and how do we think about, how do you think about it? How do you think we ought to think about it? I wanted to just ask you, to narrate a little bit of your own intellectual journey. What drew you to the study of Black life? What drew you to Black studies? And what sustains your scholarly and teaching interests in that?
Yeah. So, I think I come from a family, like my mom was really into political activism. And I remember when after 9/11, when, the U.S. said they wanted to invade Iraq, my mom was the first person to grab me and take me to a local intersection for, initiating a protest in Riverside, California. So, my mom, when she passed, actually found a lot of Assata Shakur resources under her bed. So
Wow.
Yeah, my mom was really engaged with Assata Shakur's work, and I was really influenced by her. So, I went into a master's program in general experimental psychology, and a lot of the work I was doing, especially as it relates to social psychology, we did a lot of work on discrimination, prejudice, bias, and it was appealing to me, but I think the quantifying of those things was a little bit of a challenge for me. I found it challenging to quantify, anti-Blackness, because it was something I was really interested in looking at. And, there were a lot of limits and impasses when it comes to thinking about anti-Blackness in numerical terms. Yeah. And to operationalize it in ways that I felt like were wrong. And there was a kind of a violence that comes with that, I think, in a lot of ways. So I struggled to do that kind of work. And luckily, I had a committee that was comprised of people who were really supportive of my interest in going towards theory. They actually encouraged me.
Because, fantastic. That's not usually the case, Joe.
No.
For social scientists.
No. So, here I am in this social science arena having, to force work on Black suffering within this framework of quantifying and operationalizing, and it just felt wrong. So when I look back at the work I did, I'm like, there's a lot of issues with it. And, there were a lot of unethical dimensions to it too. And so my committee, when I did my thesis defense, they noticed, they're like, your discussion section's really long, where you're, asking questions, you're looking at where the work goes in terms of, direction and, the limits, the weaknesses, the impossibilities of this kind of framework. Like, you love writing about the discussion section, but the quantitative section, I dabbled with it very lightly. I had no interest. So, my committee was like, go into theory, Shaida, like, you just need to go.
That's great.
So they were really supportive. So I actually started teaching at East Bay, Cal State East Bay, for the Ethnic Studies department after I finished my master's. And that's where I started really kind of learning about, my passion for teaching and, Black studies in particular. But I also learned the sort of limits and weaknesses of ethnic studies too. And, I went on to my PhD program, and I was very fortunate to work with one of my favorite people, Franco Barcasi, who really gave me an amazing candidacy reading list. And it was full of Black radical scholars and thinkers. And it was especially the watery scholarship that got me interested in thinking about oceanic thinking and like thalassic thinking. So it was like work like Dion Brand, Christina Sharp, Tasia McDougall, Tiffany Smallwood, even Khalil Sastay and Chion Woods with Ex Aqua. Like, I started really getting into like the watery scholarship, which led me into my sort of my own questions and interests in, thinking about how what's our relationship to the sea, not just in terms of materiality, but also like our psychic relationship to the sea, and how, the violence that took place in the Middle Passage has really shaped our relationship to the sea. And so I dove into European humanist work, European philosophy on thalassic, thinking. And I kind of wanted to like read in between the lines to see like, what are those psychic underpinnings that inform us in terms of how we see ourselves in relationship to the water, and this sort of sublimity that's attached to it, and how that can really sort of give us a way to think about, how humans on land relate to Black objection as this sort of, and how it's sort of characterized by, thinking about Hartman's work, like this terror and pleasure, this intersection of terror and pleasure. Something that's both, fascinating and fear eliciting at the same time. So that's where my work on like, oceanic thinking came into play. So yeah.
Yeah. So there's a lot that's super interesting about that. I mean, finding Assata Shakur materials, in your mother's belongings is pretty amazing. Just as a total side note, I mean, it's not a podcast about me, but I remember going through some of my father's stuff when he passed away, and finding a Free Angela Davis button. And I was like, we never talked about this, but nevertheless, you can kind of see how these things that are like little signs or symbols actually end up being a quiet animation of a whole kind of political training, which is also part of intellectual sensibility. I mean, I think that's what I heard in what you were talking about taking you to this intersection to protest war. It's like, that's not just political education, it's also changing your intellectual sensibilities from the very beginning.
Yeah.
And also the errant path I always find really interesting, of like, I thought this was like a way of studying discrimination and prejudice, but finding in the error or the failure, like this wasn't what I wanted to do, actual depth of what you want to do. And I talk to students about that all the time. I'm like, if you're going to do a master's degree, you may end up thinking like, this wasn't what I wanted to do all along, but it's incredible what you can learn from an errant path, right?
Yeah.
That's
yeah, and
I'm glad that I'm glad you had committee members that pushed you in a good direction too.
Oh yeah, I was very fortunate, because I look back at the work I did and I'm like, damn, what was I doing? Like, what was I even doing over there? But that's the part of the sort of intellectual path of growing and learning and undoing some of this stuff, and and cultivating new ways of thinking, for sure. Yeah.
Well, there's that other side when you go back and look at what you've done. I mean, I think about my own like early work in European philosophy. I was like, what I wouldn't give to revise some of those phrasings like the human person. When all of a sudden you discover this is like deeply bound up with a discourse that I didn't know, right? But ultimately, if these are paths and they have this sort of errantry as part of them, the destination is good. And finding a really great home, I mean, Ohio State's doctoral program in Black Studies, it's African American Studies, right?
African American African Studies, yeah.
African American African Studies. It's just a really first-rate program, so what a place to end up. And so this probably has to do somewhat with your arrival there in this moment of transition, but I also want to ask this big question about the origins of the field and how you think about Black studies in relation to that origin. Its origin has, for me, these twin or companion pressure points, right? One is political activism, which is so deeply connected to community and student uprisings and the need to reconfigure in some deep political way the relationship of higher education spaces to Black communities. That's part of the founding of Black Studies. But also part of that is, the absolute lack or total absence of representation of the Black intellectual tradition and disciplines for all of those decades and centuries. Black Studies also served that role to give voice to that, expand it, investigate it. But for me, there's an interesting tension there between the development of an intellectual tradition and the political pressures that really call you to a certain kind of community responsibility. And so I call it attention because I think we are all working with that in one way or another. And I'm curious for you, and it's especially interesting given your path through social science and to African American and African studies. How does the field sort of appear for you in relation to this origin?
Yeah, so I've noticed even just in different academic settings, there's always like a leaning towards one or the other, where there's this deep investment in practicality. What can we do on the ground? Or, there's more of a lean on sort of the armchair thinking, the sort of being in that space of like theorizing and stuff. And I see that both are equally important, but there's always this leaning towards one more than the other. And so I try to, in my pedagogical approach, I try to balance the two. But, for me, I think what is really important to kind of keep in mind, like, just speaking for myself, like I try to, keep things in a balanced way where it's like, okay, not being too heavily invested in the more sort of prescriptive remedy of things, and being more realistic in terms of, okay, like, let's not get too caught up in this like utopian way of thinking, but rather, thinking critically, and, being able to sort of acknowledge the more uncomfortable things about anti-Blackness and thinking about it at the level of the structural, as opposed to just focusing on the sort of material, like, let's dismantle, but like, hey, let's think about this, how deep it really is. And then, create that connection to on the ground organizing. Because I think what can be cultivated in academic spaces can truly be, politically potent and can really properly inform what's happening on the ground. Because I think the on the ground stuff can't be as powerful if there isn't this true affirmation of structural anti-Blackness at the level of Black social death. If that can't be acknowledged in a way that's honest and engaged with in a way that, is it's willing to sit with it, then I don't know what those sort of on the ground movements are really going to look like. And so for me, it's like, how do you, there's always that question of like, what do we do? Right? Like, what do we do then? What's the solution? And I think, sometimes it's okay not to think about what the solution is, but, being okay with no solution sometimes, or thinking about the limits of the solution or the impasse of that solution. And I think that that's something I'm constantly having to grapple too, especially when you go in the classroom and you're teaching these things that can be perceived as nihilistic or pessimistic. You kind of have to create a balance, where you acknowledge that there's room to create movement on the ground, but there are limits and there's sort of, boundaries when it comes to that too. Yeah.
So one of the things I find really interesting, among many things, find really interesting about what you had said there is this word that you use, impasse. And I think when we think really hard about the politics of Black studies and its political impact, it's in the urgency of these questions, that the question of Black politics is so, you can't really say, just wait, or it's a sort of secondary concern. That question of impasse can be so difficult because we end up being really, it sounds like you don't care about politics. But I also, one thing when Ashley and I were talking about questions for this podcast, one of the things that struck me about, I don't want to say odd, but sort of temporally specific about the question is that I'm not sure in 2024 we can even just say that the study of Black intellectual life is somehow detached from politics. People are losing jobs in whole fields, and offices are getting shut down in places simply because of the racial focus of what they do. And so even that impasse has a sort of new or different space of impasse, I think.
Yeah, for sure.
And, I'm teaching in Maryland, you're teaching in California, but if we were teaching in Florida and Texas, sometimes I wonder how this question would sound different to us. So, your work is so, as you were saying, like really invested in theory and history, and I'll say literature in the broadest sense, like really interested in figures of thought and tropes. And it really, I think, generates a really potent insights for Black life. So I'm interested in how you think of your work in relation to the past of the field. Like, where do you think it sort of fits or is connected? But also, just as much as that, where do you see your work pushing the field in new directions?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think, what I really admire about like the lineage or the tradition of Black studies is the beautiful presence of a lot of metacritique, like rich metacritique. Mm-hmm. And so my work, I love metacritique. I think there's a lot of power in it. So, in terms of, seeing my own work in relationship to, the past sort of present, the past of Black studies, I think there's, keeping up that metacritique, I think is very important. Mm-hmm. And, for me, my work touched on a lot of different disciplines. I was engaged with, psychology, philosophy, geography, and so it was heavily interdisciplinary. And so, I think for me, like one hope that I have is, with the work that I do is I'm hoping that because I critically engage with these different disciplines, and there's a lot of critical interrogation in my work. I interrogate, critical geography in a lot of ways, in terms of, how a lot of these disciplines, philosophy, geography, even the social sciences, for example, they have a lot of roots in in terms of being inherently anti-Black in a lot of ways. Mm-hmm. And so my hope in the kind of work I do is like, okay, can that invite further conversation and these disciplines to sort of be able to rethink their objectives and their overall intentionality, and to be willing to stay in touch with anti-Blackness and to sort of think about how the discipline and the coherence of that discipline is oftentimes very much parasitically dependent on Black objection, Mm-hmm. I wonder if that's something that, these disciplines could ever sort of grapple with and be able to come to terms with, because I've noticed that there's this sort of reluctance, and there's this sort of anxiety in doing so. Mm-hmm. It's more of like an anemic fashioning of Black radical thought. Okay, let's pull it in and engage with it and play with it a little bit, dabble with it, but never truly sit with it. And, I'm kind of thinking about Wilderson's words, to be able to dance with Black social death. Like, are you willing to dance with it? Mm-hmm. To intimately sort of, come to terms with it and to think about that parasitic relationship. And, my work, I hope my intent is to sort of invite those conversations, mm-hmm. And I think, if disciplines are willing to sort of stay in touch with that, to rethink their objectives, the disciplinary objectives, and to shift their pedagogy in a way that, places Black voices front and center, and puts, Black radical thought front and center when it comes to, research and looking at, various topics or whatever. And to also put your money where your mouth is. And what I mean by putting, your money where your mouth is, these various departments associated with different disciplines, they can play a collaborative role in assisting Black Studies departments who are extremely underfunded. We already know that. So I just think about those things. How can these various disciplines, these departments, shift their approach where, they do the work of acknowledging their relationship to anti-Blackness, and not just in these very anemic, like surface level ways that are oftentimes, pretty offensive. It's like, okay, you want to dabble with having a Black speaker come in and, talk about, anti-Blackness, but then you turn around and the work you're producing is basically reproducing the very thing we're trying to get rid of. So I think about those things too, so my work is, heavily interdisciplinary, and, I hope that it invites that sort of dialogue for sure.
And I think there's something really interesting, and this is what in the long sort of horizon of this podcast series, I'm interested in is people with doctoral training in Black Studies programs, how that very question comes up, because I think when you have Black Studies programs, departments that are comprised of disciplinary people, and I myself am trained in a discipline, as are most of my colleagues, that question that you're asking about, basically like a Black Studies sensibility or methodology speaking back to disciplines is really not so much how we talk about it when we come from a disciplinary perspective and gather together as multiple disciplines. That inter part that you're talking about being an interdisciplinary scholar who's interdisciplinary trained versus a multidisciplinary department. It just makes a broader set of critical questions, I think, get asked back to the disciplines, which is hard to do because, of course, disciplines are like, well, you really don't know about psychology or sociology. You're not trained in that. But it's like that moment when Black Studies has the confidence, the will, and the often the courage, because of the academic politics of it all, to make that talk back, I think is where we become in the institutional intellectual life circles really insurgent and really actually quite radical, like the way you put it. It's like, are you willing to dance with anti-Blackness? Like, that's not dance just like as entertainment, but like as intimacy, as someone who leads and who you lead. And that level of contact is really, that figure is really interesting for me, that dance with, because it suggests an intimacy you can't withdraw yourself from. Whereas when a multidisciplinary department, everybody can retreat into their disciplines. Yeah.
Yeah, no, John, I think the relationship that a lot of these disciplines have to Black Studies is again, like it reminds me of that sublime sort of dynamic of like this push-pull, right? Where you want to dabble with anti-Blackness because, it sort of enhances your political agenda, and it makes your agenda seem a little more radical, right? There's this desire to mess with it on a very surface level. But, and I think it's done in a lot of ways to alleviate certain anxieties, right? To sort of, circumvent the possibility of being labeled as anti-Black, or like not being inclusive of Blackness and anti-Blackness in the epistemology, right? It's like, how do I, sort of incorporate it, but not incorporate it to the extent that I become uncomfortable and it provokes that anxiety, right? So that anxiety is real. I feel like a lot of these disciplines have that. And, it's this reluctance and, but also a desire to incorporate it, to feel better, to be able to sleep at night, basically, right?
Yeah. Yeah, no, I love that characterization of it. And like I said, I think that's a characterization that comes from a different kind of doctoral training, and we need lots of it, because I agree with you. I think that kind of insurgency, that kind of, pushing back and asserting a voice, it's hard to do from one discipline towards another, but from that interspace, I think there's a lot to be gained from there, and there's a lot of controversy and personal animosity to be had inside hallways. But in the end, like, what are we fighting for if we're not fighting for the integrity of Black life and social death, right? That these things have to be taken seriously in that way.
Yeah, you can't do that work without, being engaged with anti-Blackness. That none of that work can be done truly from an ethical standpoint without engaging with it,
Yeah. So let's get to convincing everybody on that. Absolutely. So speaking of hallways, your PhD was in African Studies at Ohio State, and you work in an ethnic studies department. And as you said, you worked before your doctoral training in that. So I'm curious how your teaching and thinking has been impacted in that mixture, right? Because it's two area studies, and so neither is retreating to a discipline, either in your doctoral training or in your work. But I'm very curious to hear you talk about how ethnic studies, which is going to deal with anti-Blackness, but also all kinds of other questions, how that's impacted your thinking, but also your teaching.
Yeah, so when I was teaching for, ethnic studies at East Bay before I went into my PhD program, I did notice when I was teaching, Black-centered courses, the analytical frameworks that were, basically being applied in these spaces of conversation about Blackness and anti-Blackness were the very same analytical frameworks that were being applied to non-Black people of color. So the grammars of suffering were being blurred. And, there was this sort of umbrella idea of a shared grammar of suffering and this homogenizing framework of racialization. And ultimately, anti-Blackness and Blackness were basically an unthought, right? The particularities of that suffering. And I noticed those limits and those impossibilities of, the discipline. And there were courses like, decolonize your diet, right? And I was like, well, how do you have a class like that for the Black diaspora? What would that look like? Would that even be applicable? And so Black students didn't have opportunities to have classes like that. But Latinx students had classes like decolonize your diet and these very culture-centered courses. And in the case of, Black-centered courses, they were very culture-centered, but there was this failure to sort of, acknowledge that, yeah, there is a Black culture, but it's inevitably tethered to violence all the time. Whereas, when you're talking about, other people of color, there's something to hinge on to in terms of things that exist outside of that disequilibrium or that devastation. Whereas in the case of, Black students, they didn't have opportunities to really dive into, like classes that really focus on like liberation. Like, what does that mean in the case of Black students? What would that look like? It's not going to be anywhere near the same approach as if you apply it to, non-Black students of color. And so, we focused on identity politics, decolonization, the settler colonial paradigm, all that stuff just seemed incongruent for me when it came to teaching these courses. But I didn't have a real language to make sense of it because I wasn't trained enough to make sense of it. But then when I got into my PhD, I'm like, well, shit, this is why I was feeling that way. It's because these things were not applicable in a lot of ways.
Yeah, I think you not stumbled on, you sort of walked us through one of these uncomfortable legacies of anti-Blackness as a paradigm for all things is the usefulness of Black people, and that idea that Black people are here to be used and useful does, to put it lightly, does not have a great heritage, right? But also the affirmation of these different pathways, as you say. I mean, I think decolonizing diet is a really interesting way to think about this and put this, as a particular course and gather these tensions around it. And I sometimes I think this is a really important question because I think where we're headed as academia downsizes is folding a lot of Black studies departments into ethnic studies. I know it's come up at both places I've taught as Black studies professor, and you put it in that comment so precisely what's at stake, and there's a lot at stake in that. So. And again, I love these intellectual moments of like not feeling comfortable with something. Then through study, right, at Ohio State, you understand like that discomfort was a clue about something very deep and very big. Yeah. So maybe this has, maybe this is connected to that, but I'm curious if when you think about Black studies as a discipline, as an interdiscipline, and looking at its history, I'm curious what you think it's done well, but also I'm curious what you think it has not done particularly well.
Well, I think, I listened, to your other amazing, brilliant people who've been on your been here talking and stuff. And I listen to John Marino, and at the end of the day, I think we all acknowledge, that there's this neoliberalization of the discipline that, needs to be navigated and, confronted in a lot of ways. And, we're all trying to figure out how to navigate that. And so I think that's one part of it that always needs work. But I also think just, and even at the level of the individual, I think, creating a better sense of community and to kind of stepping outside of that performative nature that we tend to engage with, or that desire for competitiveness, I think that can really help Black studies a lot, in terms of us creating a sense of intellectual community in order to create better spaces and conversations that really matter. I think that if we work on breaking those things a little bit more, it could really, landscape a better terrain for, critical conversation, critical intellectual exploration. Because that's something I think I see among a lot of people in Black studies, is that there's this sense of loneliness. We're all wanting to do this work, but there isn't a sense of, having a community that's supportive and that you can bounce ideas off without that sense of performativity, like going to conferences and that rigidity of that performativity. And, having to act a certain way. Like, I love conversations like this. I feel like this is, for me personally, more generative than going to a conference and, having to be in that space of rigidity and discomfort, and being able to break those walls a little bit, I think would help a lot. And also just, at the end of the day, even going back to the idea of, being able to acknowledge the paradigm. Because I think a lot of times that idea of practicality and identity politics can be sort of the forefront of Black studies. But I think, when Black studies can really sit with the paradigm and acknowledge it, I think that's when, true shape-shifting work can be done.
I love that. Yeah, I think how to make intellectual life and professional life work in an intellectually productive way is always really difficult. But I think there is something about Black studies where the gravity and sort of magnetic force of a different kind of community ought to be in place. I think in the, when it's in times of crisis, people are very good at that, like at its origins. But as it's become more diffuse and important in the academy, I think it really tests our commitment to those notions of community. And ultimately, it's also, we all are a product of our culture. And, what is the United States if not a personal, individual, striving culture? I mean, neoliberal is the way to capture that. But I think you're right. Like thinking about and asserting and believing in and valuing and centering on the paradigm. I like the way you put that. Changes that kind of relationship. Yeah.
And I think just pushing back on the gaze of the institution, the anti-Black gaze and the policing that takes place within these spaces, the policing of our knowledge production and, the work that we do. It's real, I experience, I'm sure, people listening, I mean, it's always happening. So I think for me, that's maybe something to throw in too. Yeah.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And that's, you brought up the podcast with John, we arrived at one point, one of us said, I can't remember what, but, how to be radical with funding is really hard, but also that's how to be a part of an institution and believe in something like higher education, but not be captured by its gaze. little by little, but we seem to kind of move in the opposite direction. Money changes things, and that's a terrible thing. Let me ask a really big speculative question. This is another one of these questions I'm always interested in, how discipline-trained people who go into Black studies this question might resonate differently than those trained in Black studies who then maybe teach in disciplines or area studies as well. And that is this, right? How do we measure, or how ought we measure, the success of Black studies? Because one thing I can see is, Black studies, one of the, as we already talked about, one of the founding imperatives was, there ought to be this representation of the intellectual tradition. It's not in discipline, so we need Black studies to do that work. Is a sign of the success of Black studies that it does that work so well that the disciplines no longer need correction, that your history departments, your sociology departments, et cetera, all put the study of Black life, if not at the center or the heart, take it really seriously? Or is the sign of the study, success of Black studies, that it develops its own sensibilities that could never be absorbed into disciplines, that become kind of like a discipline? Because in the former case, then the end goal of Black studies is to never have to exist again, because the disciplines can carry the study of Black life. Or should we think differently about how Black studies ought to be moving forward on its own, to use your word, paradigm? How do you think about this kind of future? Again, the biggest speculative question I could ask, like, what is the success in the future?
I don't know. It's like when you brought that up, like the first thing I thought about was like, or is it like, when the other disciplines basically become annihilated, that's when Black studies is surviving and doing great.
Yeah. the disciplines as we know them, they become unrecognizable
before they wither away and become nothing. Like, maybe that's a great sign.
Yeah.
Wow, that's a loaded question. I think, honestly, I kind of am gonna go along with what I just said. It's like, because I think if other disciplines begin to truly turn inward and really come to terms with the relationship with Black abjection and Black social death, I mean, they're going to become nothing. Mm-hmm. And if that critical interrogation continues and those meta critiques continue, then I think there's a lot to be said about, like, where they're going to be at in terms of of their coherence. Maybe if we continue to disrupt the coherence of those disciplines, then that'll be a good sign. Yeah.
Yeah, I think this, for me, it's a question of the integrity of the field of Black studies. What exactly is a sign of its integrity? Is it transformation of others or the creation of itself? And I see work in that going in such different directions, like people working in the field in such different directions. I've said this in a couple of podcasts before, but I've had students say, like, why would I come over to Africana Studies and major here? I feel like I got a Black studies education in the English department, which has a huge number of people who work on Black culture and Black literature. And that, like, posed this question for me. It's like, is it like Black studies has done such great work on that English department that you can study Black life there? Or is it like, do I need an answer there? So maybe it's a question where I'm trying to get this answer from other people, but the commitment to that, to Black studies as its own field, I want a good answer to that question. It's like, yes, that is Black studies. You have two options, or is it like, no, what we're doing here is different?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, those are really interesting points. Yeah, and I think, like, I really am, like, invested in this idea of just, like, undoing before creating, Mm-hmm. So that's kind of where my head is at, is like the undoing has to be done, before any creating.
And I like that because you kind of you absolutely reversed my question about, like, it's because I was thinking embellish the disciplines, and you're like, oh, you mean if we've torn them so far apart that they've had to be reconstructed
from the ground up, from the roots. Yeah.
So just in case anybody was wondering if you were trained by Afro pessimists. I think but I do think this is like some of the most enduring and important insights of Afro pessimism is that sense of the absolute contamination of the world as we know it by anti-Blackness. So
yeah, when the humanities like is basically burned to the ground, then we know Black studies is thriving.
I like that. H. Rap Brown plus the humanities equals this as our success. Okay. I like that. We'll see what I don't think my provost listens to this, but I'm curious what she would think, but I like that.
When I say burned down, I'm not meaning in a literal sense, just for the record.
These are brick buildings here, so good. Yeah. Melted down, crushed. So let me ask a last, and this is less a speculative question and more, what if Shaida had a moment to press us all in a particular direction? What do you think the field of Black studies ought to be asking? What do you think is the most urgent question we should be asking?
There's a part of me that feels like, I think for me, it's, to what extent is there disruption? Like I'm like heavily invested in disruption, so I feel like, if the work isn't disrupting, then there's something to be said about that. So I think that's like an overarching question that should kind of remain in the back of everyone's minds when they're doing this kind of work is like, to what extent does this create like, groundbreaking movement, where you're disrupting the coherence of things. Yeah, that's kind of, but I also know the limits in terms of me answering that question, given my position out. I kind of like, I don't know if I want to go further with answering that question, but I would say for me personally, I think about, the level of disruption in my work. Yeah.
And I think that's a question for all area studies, whether it's women and gender studies, sexuality studies, Latinx studies, indigenous studies. For me, that like, how disruptive are we is an enduring question to ask, and a really hard one because, disruption is exhausting and job risking and all of those things. But, as you said, this is also what ought to constitute the ethical and political orientation of the field. So it seems inherent in your very characterization of the field that we should ask this question.
Yeah.
Well, I love that. This is a really nice place to end, so everybody listening, how can you be more disruptive tomorrow or even with the rest of your day? But I really appreciate you taking the time. This has been a fantastic conversation. And, I was really looking forward to hearing what you had to say. And you've had a lot of thoughtful things to say. And, I really love this when it comes to this at the end of a podcast. I've learned a lot and I'm leaving with a lot to think about. So I really appreciate that. Thank you so much.
I've learned a lot, and I'm definitely going to have a lot to think about based on these really beautifully curated questions. And John, it's always a pleasure. It's always an honor. Cool.
Oh, same here. So have a great rest of the day.
You too. Thank you so much.
All right. Take care.
All right.